There is a particular kind of silence that a man carries home from war that has nothing to do with the absence of sound. It is a silence that lives inside the noise, that sits in the middle of a crowded room and makes everything around it feel like it is happening on the other side of a window. Garrett Hale knew this silence better than most because he had two versions of it, the one he had brought back from 15 years as a Navy SEAL, and the one that had been given to him by an explosion on a mountainside in a country most Americans could not place on a map, which had taken 60% of the hearing in his left ear and 30% of the hearing in his right, and left him living in a world where sound arrived edited, partial, and often without the context that made it make sense. He had spent the 18 months since his medical discharge learning to read lips well enough to hold a conversation, learning to position himself in rooms so that the sounds he still had access to came from the right direction, and learning to pretend, with a convincing skill born of long practice, that none of this cost him as much as it did. What he had not yet learned was what to do with a morning that had no mission in it. This is a story about a dog that had no name and a man that had no plan, and what the two of them found together in the woods of western North Carolina that neither one had known they were looking for. If this story can find you wherever you are tonight, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from. And if you believe that some things only reveal themselves to people who are still willing to walk into the woods alone, subscribe to this channel before we go any further. Garrett Hale was 41 years old, and he had arrived in the town of Cullowhee, North Carolina, 8 months earlier with 2 duffel bags, a medical discharge certificate, a tinnitus prescription he did not fill, and the contact information for a VA audiologist he had not called. He was 6 feet even, lean and angular with a runner's build that he maintained not out of vanity, but because the alternative was sitting still, and sitting still had become something his body did not fully accept. His hair was dark and kept short, his face angular and clean-shaved, with a stillness in his expression that people often read as coldness, but was more accurately described as the face of a man who had learned to concentrate hard on things that other people processed automatically. He had rented a small house at the edge of the Tuckasegee River because the listing mentioned 3 acres of woods behind the property, and he had thought, standing in the parking lot of a grocery store in Fayetteville trying to parse a conversation around him through the roaring in his ears, that what he needed more than anything else was a place where there was less to hear, and he had already made his peace with that. He had no social worker, no foster program, no neighbor who brought food. He had bought a pair of high-end hearing aids that he wore some days and not others, because some days the partially restored world felt like too much and the quiet one felt more honest. He had grown up in a small town 2 hours east of Cullowhee, the son of a man who worked his whole life in a furniture factory and a mother who taught 4th grade for 30 years, and he had joined the Navy the week after graduating high school because it was the largest version of a world he could imagine from where he was standing, and he had wanted to stand somewhere bigger. He had been good at the work in the specific way that certain people are good at things that require them to operate entirely in the present tense. And the present tense had suited him fine for 15 years, because the alternative, a sustained engagement with the past or the future, had always seemed like a luxury that his assignment did not budget for. Now he had nothing but future, and it sat on the kitchen table every morning like a bill he could not read. He had not spoken to his mother in 3 weeks, not because they were estranged, but because phone calls required him to work harder than he let on, and he had not yet found a way to explain that without making her feel like the problem. His one reliable daily structure was a walk into the woods behind the house, 2 miles out on a deer trail that followed the creek, turn around at the granite outcrop where the ridge opened, 2 miles back. He did this every morning before the light fully arrived, because the woods at dawn had a quality that the day later in it did not, a provisional quietness that felt less like absence and more like patience. He found the dog on a Thursday morning in early November, about a mile up the creek trail, in a stretch of the woods where someone had illegally dumped a rusted washing machine and 2 tires in what he suspected was a recurring problem. The dog was underneath the washing machine. Not trapped, exactly, but sheltering, curled tight in the cavity created by the drum's angle against the ground, with the particular compression of an animal that has learned to make itself take up as little space as possible. She was a large hound mix, predominantly black with rust-colored legs and a deep rust chest, with long ears, a narrow, thoughtful face, and the kind of eyes that seemed to carry a running assessment of the situation without communicating its conclusions. She was thin, but not critically so, her coat rough but not matted, with a faded scar across her right shoulder that suggested an old wound that had healed without attention. She did not run when Garrett crouched down at a respectful distance, but she did not come forward either. She watched him with the cautious patience of an animal that has been disappointed by humans often enough to no longer rush the evaluation process. He left her there that morning because he did not have anything to offer her, and because he did not know what to do with her, and because something about the situation felt too familiar to approach quickly. He went back to the house and stood in the kitchen for a while, and then drove to the general store in town and bought a bag of dog food he put in the truck bed without thinking too hard about why. The next morning he went back to the creek trail with the bag and filled a metal bowl he'd brought from a kitchen cabinet and left it 10 feet from the washing machine, and walked another 100 yards up the trail and sat on a fallen log and waited. He had done enough surveillance in enough countries to understand the patience required for a subject to decide to trust its environment. After 20 minutes, he heard the sound of metal against metal, the bowl shifting on the frozen ground, and he did not move. After another 10 minutes, he walked back. The bowl was empty. The dog was watching him from the shadow of the rusted drum, with an expression that had shifted perhaps 3 degrees toward provisional. This went on for 9 days. On the 10th day, she met him at the edge of the drum before he set the bowl down, not close enough to touch, but close enough that the decision was clearly deliberate. On the 11th day, she followed him 50 yards down the trail before sitting down and watching him continue without her. On the 14th day, she walked the full 2 miles back to the house and sat outside the back door and looked at it with the composed expectation of someone who has decided that an application process has been completed and is waiting for. The result: he let her in. She investigated every room with the same methodical, unhurried thoroughness as a building inspector who has all day and intends to be thorough, and then chose the braided rug in front of the wood stove and settled onto it with the conclusive air of a creature who has identified her position and intends to hold it. He named her Creek because that was where she had come from, and because he was a man who found anchoring names to geography more reliable than anchoring them to qualities that might change. The veterinarian in Silva, a patient young woman named Dr. Asha Patel, who had grown up in Kalohi and come back after veterinary school, examined Creek and found her to be in better condition than her circumstances suggested. Spayed, approximately 3 years old, with no microchip but an old embedded collar impression on her neck, suggesting she had worn one for most of her life before losing it. The scar on her shoulder was consistent with a barbed wire injury. There was nothing in any database that matched her description. She had belonged to someone, and then she had not, and the record of the transition did not exist. The trouble came in the form of a surveyor's ribbon Garrett found tied to a pine near the washing machine on a Thursday in late November, and then found again every 30 yards up the ridge trail for as far as he walked before turning back. He had grown up in a small enough town to understand what surveyor's ribbons in a forest meant, and the understanding sat in his stomach for 3 days before he drove into town and asked at the county assessor's office. A development company called Blue Ridge Horizon LLC had purchased 700 acres of the ridge above his property in October and had submitted a preliminary permit application for a resort clearing. The permit process would take months, the clerk told him pleasantly, and there were channels. The company's project manager, a man named Dennis Farrar, returned his call 2 days later from what sounded like a conference room and used the words unfortunate but inevitable in the first 90 seconds, which told Garrett everything he needed to know about whether this would be a conversation or a performance. What the development meant, practically, was that the woods Creek had come from were about to be significantly altered, and that whatever had displaced her the first time was likely to displace more animals in the coming months. Garrett did not consider himself an environmentalist in any organized sense, but he had spent 15 years operating in places where the disruption of a landscape changed everything about how a life could be lived in it, and he recognized the pattern. He also recognized that he was one person with a partial hearing loss and no particular political capital, which meant that doing anything useful would require finding people who had more of one or both of those things than he did. The person Garrett found was not who he expected. Henry Swaney was 83 years old, had lived in the same house in a hollow 2 miles from the ridge in question for his entire life, had served in Korea and come home and never once mentioned it to anyone, and had been managing a moderate hearing loss of his own since the early 1970s without ever quite using that word for it. He was a small, precise man with white hair combed carefully and eyes that were still sharp and somewhat amused, and he communicated with a directness that Garrett recognized as the particular efficiency of people who have given up on preamble. When Garrett found him, through a chain of referrals that began at the general store and ended at a back porch, Henry was sitting with a cup of coffee and an open map of the ridge spread on a folding table, because apparently he had also noticed the ribbons and had been expecting someone to arrive eventually. He was not surprised that the someone turned out to be a veteran. He said only that he was glad Creek was all right and that he had been worried about her, and that he had about 4 generations of knowledge about what those woods contained if Garrett wanted any of it. Henry had grown up knowing every family that had lived on that ridge, every hollow that flooded, every spring that ran cold through August, and every piece of land that had changed hands under circumstances that didn't bear close examination. He had a box of photographs, a stack of letters from the County Historical Society, and a neighbor named Patricia Birdsong who taught environmental law at Western Carolina University and had been looking for a specific kind of case for 3 years. Garrett called Patricia on a Tuesday morning with Creek lying across his feet and his hearing aids in and his lip-reading attention fully engaged, and by the end of the call he had the beginning of something that resembled a plan, which was more than he had walked into those woods with at any point in the preceding 8 months. The permit process took 11 months and did not ultimately stop the development, because development of private land rarely stops completely, but it significantly reduced the scope of the clearing, required the company to establish a wildlife corridor that preserved the creek drainage where Garrett had found Creek, and generated enough local attention that Blue Ridge Horizon LLC's next permit application in an adjacent county was met with an organized opposition that moved faster than the first one had. Garrett testified twice in front of the county planning board, the first time with Henry beside him and the second time alone, with Patricia's legal summary in his hand and Creek in a service vest beside his chair, because Dr. Patel had helped him document the therapeutic legitimacy of her presence, which was real regardless of the paperwork. He had not expected to be able to do this, specifically the speaking in rooms part. He had not expected his voice to come out at the right volume or his words to arrive in the right order when the hearing in his ears was doing what it sometimes did. What he had not accounted for was that he had spent 15 years giving briefings in high-pressure environments, and that whatever the explosion had taken from his ears, it had not taken that. And that Creek on a service vest beside his chair was something his peripheral vision could find in the moments when his focus fractured, and finding her was enough to bring the room back. His mother drove out from the other side of the state in April to see the house and meet Creek, and she sat at the kitchen table and cried a little without explaining why, which she was entitled to do. And Creek put her head in his mother's lap, and his mother's hand went to Creek's ear without looking down, the automatic gesture of a woman who has always known that living things move toward kindness. His mother said she was glad he had found the dog. Garrett said the dog had found him, and his mother said she suspected that was true of most good things, and he did not argue with that because he had come to believe it himself. There is a silence that a man carries home from war that has nothing to do with the absence of sound, and Garrett Hale still carries his. The tinnitus is not gone, and the hearing loss is not recovered, and some mornings the edited, partial world still costs more than it should. But Creek is on the braided rug in front of the wood stove most of those mornings, and the woods behind the house still run to a granite outcrop where the ridge opens, and the creek that gave her her name still runs through a corridor that is still standing, and Henry Swaney still has his coffee on the back porch 2 miles up the hollow, and some things have not been taken and cannot be, and knowing which things those are is the beginning of something that does not have a simpler name than staying. If this story found you tonight, share it with someone who needs a reminder that the woods are still there and worth walking into. Tell us in the comments which moment moved you most and which city you are watching from. And if you can, support a wildlife preservation program or a dog rescue near you. Subscribe to this channel and we will keep finding these stories, the ones that start in the woods before dawn and end somewhere no one expected.